In the 1970s, there was a small shop in Berwick Street called Dark They Were and Golden Eyed. Now, for those who don't know Berwick Street, it was a market street with fruit stalls lining the narrow street. The smell when you walked down it was of fresh and slightly less fresh fruit, and the sound of almost insensible yells of market stall holders. Then walk behind a stall or two, step over a wet newspaper, and you'd open the door to a world of seeming impossibilities. Herbal cigarettes and joss stick scent, underground comics from San Francisco mixed with the greatest works of impossible literature, much of it imported and smelling of the voyage across the Atlantic. It was while browsing in this shop, and I was probably at the age of 11 or 12, that I first came across the work of Eldred Starling. The covers to his books were emblazoned with giant eyes and men with no faces lost in violet-lawned landscapes, and I was immediately drawn to them. Starling arrived on the scene, or so I believed, in the wake of Lovecraft and Bloch and Clark Ashton Smith, and he wrote some stories for Weird Tales in the late 20s. I bought 2 of his books with £1 given to me by some friend of my mother's. Like Lovecraft, Starling wrote the kind of prose that was not easy to penetrate without a dictionary at hand. Nevertheless, there was something so seductive about his twisted fantasies that I felt impelled to read them anyway, compelled, utterly compelled. The strange thing is that all the stories seem to be fundamentally the same story. They involved a protagonist who, by some means, is able to see beyond the normal 3-dimensional world that we all take for reality, and see something much darker and more terrifying than we could possibly imagine. In Starling's stories, as in those of Lovecraft, we are never alone. In fact, in those stories, the main discovery is that there is nothing to men at all. We are simply puppets of other creatures vastly more powerful than ourselves. Every mood, every thought, and every desire experienced by men was merely the play-acting of insect-like creatures who exist on a different dimensional plane to us, but are there all the time. When adolescence and the intoxicating allure of the unfair sex came to dominate me, I put aside my love of fantastic, mind-twisting literature and tried to engage with the world. I was never good at engaging with the world. I always felt slightly at odds with the world that was around me. I didn't know the rules that seemed so evident to everyone else. I couldn't lose myself in sports or politics or academic studies. So sex became the dominant element in my life. I assigned mystical significance to sex and couldn't bear the way I saw it vulgarized and simplified in the media. At times my ill ease with reality made me turn to religious answers. Science, it seemed to me, was an insufficient way to explain reality. We were much more than a way of keeping meat fresh, or so I believed. The problem was that in trying to become involved with any religious idea, I couldn't quite believe them. I found them all wanting in some way. It was so clear that these were merely ways of exerting societal controls or getting money from the gullible. I decided that my antipathy to normal life gave the inclination to become an artist. Unfortunately, I was no more gifted in this realm than I was in any other sphere of life. Then, one night, in my early 20s, all this changed. I had a dream. At least, I hoped it was a dream. I mean, it felt real enough. In my dream were my life, all my memories, everything that was me, was taken away from me by creatures beyond this reality. All those experiences which I took to be of value, all my friendships, all the people I'd known, were nothing more than fictions, played as on a video cassette to my brain by these creatures. When I woke up, I had a blasting headache, and the unbearably bright light of the moon burned a hole in my brain. I sank into a deep depression. Later, the following day, I spoke to a girl at work about the dream and the effect it had had on me, and she said, almost matter-of-factly, that it sounded like I'd been abducted by aliens. I laughed, but on some level I felt that this was exactly what had happened. The odd thing is, I suddenly remembered something from a story by Eldred Starling in which the protagonist has this exact same experience. I went to my mother's house and looked at all those old books that I'd put aside, hoping to find the story. But I couldn't find any of Starling's books. In fact, it seemed that Starling was a character I'd somehow invented, because there was no record of him in any book or any encyclopedia. It seemed, and it seems now, there was never any Eldred Starling. And when I ask around, it seems there had never been a shop in Berwick Street called Dark They Were and Golden Eyed. Ever since this time, for periods of days, sometimes weeks, I've been haunted by visions. Visions which I believed, or believe, to have come from Starling's books, but which I now see are products of my subconscious mind. Sometimes for days on end I imagine them, the insect creatures programming my life with more false memories, making me believe more and more things which have never happened, making me believe that I am just some figment in someone else's imagination. I try not to let this affect my life too much. After all, it's clearly a fantasy, a stupid story I probably invented on a dark night, but nevertheless somehow convinced myself of. But the reason I have to say this now is that I've started to hear them. In fact, I can hear them now. Small, terrible, indescribable noises. Noises that make my head ache, but ache in a different way to any other ache I've ever ached before. It's like piercing my skull. And sometimes, oh God save me, sometimes I think I can see them. Even now. They're not in front of me. I can just see something of them from the corner of my eye, at my shoulders, close to the nape of my neck, rattling their insect limbs inside my mind. Dark they are and golden-eyed.